Welcome to Connecting the Dots, a non-traditional legal program with your host and trusted advisor, Liz Myska, your guide through the web of life's dilemmas.
Welcome to another edition of Connecting the Dots. I'm your host, Liz Myska, and today I'm delighted to have another WCCA TV host, Edith Morgan from Senior Speak, join me. Welcome, Edith.
Well, happy to be here, and
I would love for in this segment for you to give us a little bit of your wisdom of your family, because I know you have a great story to share with me and the audience of where you came from and the journey that you're on. So please, I'm sitting back with my with my storybook and getting ready to hear you tell your tale.
well, how far back would you like me to go?
Start at the beginning, wherever that is.
Well, in the beginning is like 91 years ago. I'm not sure you want to go back that far. Well, it's in a sense it's pertinent. I think you and I were talking about writing family histories, and it may or may not be a book. It probably will take several different forms because I have a whole lot of different material. And since I'm the only one in my family that's still left alive, everything has sort of landed in my house because I've got the big house in Worcester and there's always some place to put it. And nowadays, the younger people go into little condos and little apartments and
tiny houses,
little bitty, and they don't have walk-in closets and they don't have huge basements and huge attics and so on. So I'm the only one that has all that. So all this stuff has accumulated in my house. And I found that rather than being able to just write it all down right away, I have a whole lot of letters and books and documents of various kinds and pictures and old articles and so on, which are rapidly turning yellow and then brown and eventually crumbling. So I've got all of that stuff, and I have to go through all of this. And recently I discovered a treasure trove of tapes that my father had done an oral history and given it to Brandeis. But since it was so long ago, it was archived, and so it was not so easy to get to. And since I'm the only living relative, they could only release it to me. So I'm listening to those, and they're like 2 hours at a time, and it gets very, very, what shall I say?
Tedious?
Well, in a way, yeah, tedious. It's interesting, but to hear him droning on for 2 hours on end and try to remember all that is... Anyway, let's start at the beginning.
Okay.
I started out, I'm a refugee. There are immigrants and there are refugees. I'm a refugee, and we were political refugees. So we got into the United States when the quotas were already filled. But let me back up and go back to Germany. I was born in Germany, in Western Germany. My father was a federal judge, but he was also Jewish and he was also liberal. And my mother was a convert to Judaism. And so if you know 1930s Germany, you know that that's a triple risk to be liberal and to be Jewish and to be a convert also. It was just very, very risky. Fortunately, my parents knew that things were going from bad to worse, and so in March of 1933, they fled Germany, and that was kind of a tricky business because my father was already under house arrest. Remember, the Germans elected Hitler in January of 1933.
Okay.
And so my father was already under house arrest because they had already partly consolidated their power. So fortunately, my father had still some powerful lawyer friends who managed to get him a few days off because my mother was having my brother baby in March. My brother was born in March. And so he was allowed out of house arrest, and he was allowed to spend a few days in vacation in the Black Forest, Well, it so happens that by train going from West Germany to the Black Forest, the train made one stop on the Swiss border. So my parents had one suitcase and an 11-day-old baby, and me was 2.5 years old.
Say, oh my
and we
goodness.
got off the train
Okay.
in Switzerland, illegally.
Okay.
And we couldn't stay in Switzerland because you had to
No papers.
we had no papers.
Right.
It's awful. You're better off being a citizen of an enemy country than you are being
Stateless.
no stateless.
Right.
Yeah, we were not stateless right away. When the Nazis found they couldn't get their mitts on us, they published these long lists of people who had left and took their citizenship away. If you don't have citizenship, you can't get a visa, and you're a non-person, basically. But the French were fairly liberal about that, and when we were in Switzerland, we were advised, since we didn't have money or jobs or anything, and they didn't want any trouble with their dangerous neighbors,
Right.
they counseled us to go over to France and report to one of the refugee committees there, and they would take care of us, which is basically what happened. So we were in France for 8.5 years, and then, of course, in June 1940, the Germans invaded France, and my mother, brother, and I were living in Paris, and we walked out for 11 days under constant bombardment with thousands of other people. That's why I can understand what's happening in Ukraine.
Right.
It's nothing new.
Right.
It's same old, you know. That's what war is like.
Exactly.
And it's generally on the citizenry that suffers, because we basically had nothing. And since my father was in law is not transferable from one country to another. There's no international law that he could have worked on, and besides, by that time, he had a supportive family and couldn't go back to school. So, to make a long story short, we managed, with the help of some Swiss friends, who basically gave life savings so that we could buy passage out of France when the part of Free France that we ended up in after our flight from Paris looked like the Germans were going to take that over. They really had expected, the Nazis had expected the Italians to come in, you know, from the east
Right.
and
Seal the deal.
occupy that part of France. But the Italians were not really mad at the French, and a lot of them didn't support Mussolini all that much. So anyway, by hook or by crook, we managed to get 4 tickets out on a reconverted freighter from Portugal. Portugal was neutral, so that was, at that time, pretty much the only way out of Europe. And the quotas in America were filled, but under Roosevelt, they established another quota for political refugees. The Jewish quota was full, and we've always had a quota system here for immigrants. Mm-hmm. Even the Europeans, everybody thinks it's easy enough if you're European, but it wasn't. If you know, coming to America, if you're an Italian worker or if you were an Irish worker and so on, it was not so easy to get in. So they know the struggle's always the same. So in New York, we stayed for about a month, and I am not exactly sure. I have to listen to my dad's tapes. But somehow or other, we got into the hands of the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers. And at that time, they had an experimental program where they thought, well, instead of allowing new refugees, all of them, to establish a new ghetto in New York or someplace in one of the big cities, spread out and make Americans out of the new immigrants. So we got taken to Scattergood Hostel in Iowa.
Wow.
And that was about as complete a culture shock as you can imagine.
Remote.
Yeah, I mean,
American Gothic. All I can think of.
The Scattergood was, when you say American Gothic, I think of the two old people who ran. It was a farm originally. It had been a Quaker school, and they had converted it, and their idea was they would take the refugee families and keep them together, but the adults would learn American history so we could get first papers and then citizenship, and the kids would go to the public school in West Branch, Iowa.
Wow.
Now, West Branch is, I don't know if it even gets on the map every time, but it was a teeny-weeny little town.
Population,
with a teeny-weeny little, yeah, and we were the only ones who didn't speak English. So, of course, we kids learned English very fast, and I have to say that I was 9 or 10 by that time, and you learn English very fast when nobody else speaks anything else.
Exactly.
And I think within about 6 months, I learned, all the English I really needed to know to get by, and we could blend in with the kids there. So that was a completely new experience, and we stayed there for 10 months, and then part of the program was after the American Friends there, a lot of them were young students and people, almost like your interns, who were there, and each one had an area of expertise, and they taught us, and we it was almost like a little commune. Our parents helped in the kitchen, and I've never seen my father lift a towel or do any of that sort of stuff, but I still have pictures of him with an apron on in the kitchen helping, precious. And so we lived there for 10 months, and then one of the Quakers was assigned to find us a home and a job for my father and a place to live. And in those days, you had to have a sponsor. That would be a family who could afford to support you if you couldn't support yourself, so that you wouldn't become a burden on the society, so you wouldn't become a welfare case. So we were shipped to St. Paul, Minnesota. They found my dad a job. He found a series of jobs. One of the jobs he got was eventually, after he finished working briefly in a factory, and I've never seen my father have a beer, but when he worked at the factory at noontime, everybody had a beer for refreshment, and so my father had one, which was unusual, because my mother, although she was a German, believed that beer softens your brain and you shouldn't drink beer. So I grew up with some of her prejudices. And so we lived in the Twin Cities. I went to high school there, and in a poor section, it was always the high school, Marshall High School in St. Paul, was about half black students from the South who'd come up to work, and immigrants, us, who were, say, bilingual, but, we all got along. We were all in the same boat. We all had nothing.
Right.
And we were all trying to work our way up and survive in America. So I went to school there, and then we moved to Minneapolis and went to West High, where I graduated. And then I went to McAllister College, and by that time my father had stopped working at the ASTP program in Minnesota. At the University of Minnesota, it was World War II, and they were training soldiers to learn German and Japanese for the armies of occupation. Okay. Japanese for, the Pacific theater, and then German for the occupation of Germany when they got it. Well, as usual, of course, my father was teaching German there, and a lot of those troops went to Japan, but that's the way it always goes. Snafu as usual, everything is always, but you know how bureaucracies work, they have not changed. So my dad was not particularly comfortable at the University of Minnesota because there was the German department had a strong German Bund group.
What is it?
The German Bund they were Nazis.
Oh. Okay.
They were pro-Germany, pro-Hitler, and anti-war.
Okay.
And he would not feel comfortable in that environment. So he found a job as a professor of German at McAllister College. Huh? And since it didn't pay much in those days, professor didn't get much. But the nice benefit was that, you're a PK, you're like the preacher's kid, you're a professor kid. So you got free tuition. So that was, I was able to go to McAllister College and graduate from there. And Mondale. Remember he was vice president?
Yeah, Walter Mondale, yes.
Walter Mondale was just a year ahead of me.
Really?
And his wife, Joan Adams, was, I think, either in the same year or a year behind me. Her father was a chaplain of the school. It was a small school.
Wow.
There were just over 1,000 students. And it was a wonderful environment. Everybody automatically said hello to everybody else. It was a good liberal arts school. They didn't believe in drinking. And it was a tremendous experience for me. And, of course, the price was right.
I know, right,
So,
right.
And I met my future husband there, my first husband, who was a student there who had come from Kansas. He was born, now you talk about...
Another foreign land.
Yeah, you talk about the culture shock. There was a culture shock for him because he followed his philosophy professor from Wichita, Kansas, from Friends University there. And he arrived a little bit late during the semester, and he was sitting behind me, and somehow I took notice. And the interesting thing is we found out we had birthdays on the same day. He was 6 years older than I was. So anyway, to make a long story short, after 6 weeks, we got married.
Oh, my goodness.
And I finished college, and then he, unfortunately, on a part-time job while he was still in school, fell off the freight dock and injured his back. So then I had to go to work while he finished school, and he had to take, not that kind of physically hard labor.
Right,
he had been in the Merchant Marine for 7 years. And he had decided he didn't want to be a ship's captain the rest of his life because he didn't really like to see that well.
Well, coming from Kansas, I can see why.
He ended up in the Merchant Marine, I think, because everybody was drafted in those days. And he didn't like to be in a uniform. He didn't want to be and one way to do it, if you were not a conscientious objector, was the Merchant Marine did all that Lend-Lease shipping, during the war.
I see.
So
okay.
he was on a lot of those ships that brought supplies during World War II, overseas to supply the troops in Europe. So, but at any rate, he went on later to the Masters. And again, I'll cut a few years out. We did a lot of different kinds of work. I was married for 26 years, and then we sort of drifted apart. And so I got divorced after 26 years. And he was a school psychologist in Montague there out in the western part of the state. And I stayed in here. We came, both of us, here because he had gotten a research grant at Clark University. That's what brought us to Worcester. Why Worcester from way out there?
Right.
And for him, Worcester was real culture shock too, because, if you've ever driven out in the Midwest,
It's flat.
you can see for miles. And so, if the enemy is coming, you can see them 100 miles away. Here, he felt totally closed in. The trees are all, they're all grown over. They're like a canopy over the roads. The roads are narrow. There's a lot of places there weren't even sidewalks. I mean, Worcester in the 1960s was, there were a lot of private roads. There were not sidewalks. There were, it was a completely different place from what it is now. So it was a real culture shock for him. And of course, Clark University also was a kind of culture shock. The interesting thing is that a whole lot of people thought he was the one that was Jewish in the family, and not me, because he had, in Kansas, you might have had, if you were born in Oklahoma, you might have had an Indian ancestor somewhere, which would account for, darker curl of your hair, none of which I have, and also Dutch and Welsh and everything else was all mixed over there in Kansas. So he was the real mixture, and I wasn't. And everybody who thought they could tell a Jew when they saw one always thought he was and I wasn't. And we used to get a big kick out of that. Anyway, we parted ways, and he remarried and lived in Amherst. And he's deceased. I think I'm the only one still left alive. And so I stayed here in Worcester, and I went to work as a teacher in Shrewsbury. I had been teaching, and Massachusetts had reciprocal agreements.
Okay.
So even though I had gotten certified, I should back up with my education. At McAllister, I got a wonderful liberal arts education, which equips you for nothing except, being a really good, total, all-around person.
Right.
So I had to, but there was a great teacher shortage, because remember the teachers, at least all the men had gone to war and the women were in the factories, and so there was a teacher shortage. So with a BA and taking a few courses on a Saturday, I could teach and get a full certificate. So since Kent State University isn't very far from where we were in Minnesota, during the summers, I went to Kent State University and got 45 quarter hours of education credits and got fully certified. So now I was a legitimate teacher, certified teacher.
And what were you teaching?
Well, at that time I was teaching primary grades. Later on I added stuff, and I kept taking courses, and I was certified as an art teacher and art director, certified as a principal, and certified for a whole variety of things. I kept taking courses.
You could pick?
Yeah, it gets to be a habit. Once you have the degree, and once you have the credits, and once you have...
You just augment.
And in those days, the certificates were not 5 years and have to retake like they do now. In those days, it was a lifetime certificate. So I just kept adding, areas that I could do. So I didn't have to stay in one place. But in St. Paul, I had gotten a job as before I got a teaching certificate, in a private daycare center. That was in the old days, when there were daycare centers like that. And then I went to teaching, and I taught primary grades, first grade and second grade. So I've taught a little of everything. Okay. So as I moved around, I moved in schools in Michigan and Ohio, and then came to Massachusetts, taught primary grades in Shrewsbury, and got active, of course. I'm a rabble-rouser, so I got active. That was when teachers first got the right to bargain. Up until then, the teachers group, we was just an association, we would go before the school committee, and we would say, this is what we would like, hat in hand, and we would be happy. And then they would decide. And then the state passed the collective bargaining law, which originally didn't include teachers, but which we got in eventually. And so I was president of the Teachers Association in Shrewsbury when we negotiated the first contract. And it took us 26 months. And we had to have the MTA help us, and we had to have a lawyer and so on. It was a hassle and a half. But now, of course, it's an accomplished fact. Teachers have their unions, and teachers negotiate. We argued about whether or not the part about hours and conditions of work and so on included our having something to say about curriculum. We wanted to have something to say about the curriculum. Right. You would think teachers would automatically,
exactly,
but we don't.
Right.
And so, we got hung up with the state, with the legal system and so forth. So anyway, I decided I wouldn't stay in Shrewsbury after battling the school committee, let somebody else take over. So I went out to Quabbin Regional. It wasn't regional at that time. Okay. I went out to Oakham, which is a little bitty town.
I was going to say.
So it was wonderful because every day I would drive up the hill from Worcester up towards Barry, to Oakham, and everybody else was coming the other way. I had the sun in my back always, and coming back, I had the sun in my back again, and all these other poor saps who were working in the city had the sun in their eyes. And if you know what it's like to drive into the evening sun, that is not any fun. So I did that for 21 years, and then I retired, and I decided, well, teachers never had much to say. And then I had gone into administration at Quabbin. I was a reading director and chapter 1 director and a few other things. I decided maybe if I got into politics, as a teacher, I would have something to say about education. So that's when I ran for the school committee. And of course, I was non-political, didn't have any money to put into it, and ran in Worcester, which was a wonderfully interesting experience. And
I love the way you say wonderfully interesting.
well, it was. There are 6 places on the school committee, and I came in 7th once, and nothing happened. I didn't make it, and I came in 2nd. I came in 7th again, and Harriet Chandler was on. She left, so I slipped into her place because number 7 becomes 6th when one leaves. And the next time I ran again, and this time I was 7th again, but this time Eddie Augustus was in, and he left for Washington, so I slipped into his place. And finally, the next time I ran, and I made it on my own. It can be done. So,
well, Edith, I would say persistence. Oh my goodness! I mean, you know, just from this. I don't even know what year we're up to now. What year are we? Are we up to the 80s yet, or are we up to?
No, I ran in the 90s. In
the 90s, okay.
Yeah. Well, so we're 30 years behind.
Okay, well, but again, you're 91, and we're in the story. We're up to we're up to the 90s. Right. So I just want to pull some strands out of this perseverance, adaptability, figuring it out. Not letting circumstances dictate your behavior. All of those things. When you were talking about being a teacher, all I could think of was the old paint boxes. They were white and they had the colors, you know.
Oh, yes.
and for whatever reason, that image came to my mind that you were taking your paintbrush and dipping it into a different color and saying, okay,
well, I had a choice. I either could stay in one place and move up. But there is no real career path for teachers.
Right.
You know, where do you go? If you love teaching, the only way up is out. And I didn't want to do that. Right. So I tried a lot of things. And my superintendent kept saying, well, the principal at the time at Quabbin High School said, if you stay in one place, the ladder for, your improvement in your salaries is steady, and you can go all the way up and you get another degree and you get more money. So eventually, I would have made a lot more money. Moving from one place to another, I always had to start over, and I never had tenure right away. So, but it's more interesting that way.
Right.
And I learned a lot more, and it was more challenging. To do the same thing year after year, it just didn't really appeal to me.
Absolutely. Right.
So it's a little less money.
Well,
I think we have
we've
exhausted the audience.
Well, I want to thank you for that. Was a fascinating story, but not in the sense of fascinating. I'm enraptured, but again, that perseverance, that adaptability, not only of you, but your family. That must be a strain that
yes.
runs through.
I have to hand it to my mother. Right. She always knew exactly when the time was to go and where to go.
Right, to move on.
My dad was a Renaissance scholar, but he didn't even pick out his clothes in the morning. My mother did that. So, he had his field of expertise, and she had hers. And thank God she had hers, because she saved us over and over.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that story. Again, I definitely want to hear more. And join me again for another edition of Connecting the Dots.
Please note that the information provided in this show is not a substitute for consulting with an experienced local attorney and receiving counsel based on the facts and circumstances of a particular transaction. To contact Lizbeth, email her at lizbeth@elizabethlmyska.com or call her office at 508-753-7681. We're online at connectingthedots.lawyer. Executive producers, Lizbeth Myska and Jack Peacock. Producers, John Medberry and Bill Hamilton. A production of Elizabeth L. Myska, J.D., LLM, in association with compliments.